Well, the left has already lost the 2020 election, and here's why. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, a columnist in the New York Times, David Leonhardt, or Leonhardt, I'm not sure how you pronounce that.
It's certainly not Lionheart.
It's not lion, but it's Lyon. It's like the French word. He has this column under the headline, "The Simple Reason the Left Won't Stop Losing." And to just kind of condense it all into one simple concept, it's basically because the left, in his assessment, is not committed to winning. They're committed to purity. And by the left, he's talking about the real sort of progressive end of the party. He's clearly addressing, people who are supporters of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren before she dropped out, that purity matters more than victory, and that the people on the left are actually trying to campaign to run the country they wish existed, but that the demographics of even their own party don't support that. That's why the primaries have gone so badly so far for Warren. And as we record this on a day where 6 more primaries are being held in the Democratic Party, it doesn't look like things are going to go well for Bernie Sanders. What do you think of his assessment? Are they demanding purity and not victory?
I think they are. And I think he's exactly right. And I think the thing that's most striking about, there's been a lot of different philosophies, political philosophies that have been over the centuries and sustained themselves and so on. And you could bunch a lot of them under like the term of collectivism and so on. But there's something actually kind of unique about this progressive idea, the kind of progressive roots that tie in with socialism, and maybe not full-on communism or national socialism, but this whole progressive movement. And the thing that strikes me the most about that is how incredibly steeply it is powered by intellectuals. The thing that's the most striking about the Russian Revolution to me by far, is the absolutely out of touch quality of the people that actually led the revolution. Now, when I say out of touch, I don't mean out of touch with the mood of the world or with the mood of the Russian people, but the people that launched the Bolshevik Revolution were people who had spent their entire lives in French cafes or in Switzerland or in safe houses talking about theory. And as you got into the 20s and the 30s and the Great Purges, you would find that people would suddenly disappear in the course of the night because they were suddenly considered to be, forget being a Trotskyist, that was an automatic death sentence. But all of a sudden, Bukharinism becomes out of favor, and I used to be a Zenobiite, but now I'm more of a it's this fundamental fascination with theory that seems to drive this, which reminds me of my favorite joke about this entire progressive idea, this progressive movement, and that is that you could present some sort of social plan to a progressive and show him some evidence, and the progressive would say, well, yes, it works in practice, but will it work in theory? And that's the essence of what this philosophy is. And so, yes, they are more susceptible to the allure of purity at any price than most other philosophies. And look, conservatism, how many times have you heard, I'm not voting because this guy's not a real conservative or not conservative enough? And the reply is, well, he's more conservative than the opposition. That every political idea has a desire for purity. Needless to say, we'd all like to see Ronald Reagan or some other small government conservative elected and so on. And we would like a list of things that we would like and a list of things that we wouldn't like. But I think the reason that conservatives are more amenable to compromise on this is simply because it is in the nature of conservative philosophy to understand that the world is an imperfect place and that we have to live in the world that we live in. And there is no perfect, there's only the good. And that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and on and on and on. There's a fundamental realism that conservatism is based on, and that the entire structure of the United States government is predicated not on the goodness of men, but on the badness of men, of what men are capable of in terms of reaching for power and money and all the rest.
So this columnist in the New York Times says that progressives have chosen to lose on their own terms rather than win with compromise. And that's really the heart of the idea.
That's it.
It's can you compromise? He goes on to say, and I'm quoting him at length here, their political strategy is to insist that Americans are a profoundly progressive people who just haven't been inspired to vote the way they think. And then he goes on to do a laundry list of ideas that progressives think that Americans want a lot more immigration. Americans want abortion with no restrictions. Americans absolutely want to stop fracking. Americans want more gun control, more affirmative action, a wealth tax, free college, Medicare for all, widely available marijuana. And these activists say that Americans want all of that. But when voters are given a chance to vote on a lot of those things, they say they don't want unrestricted immigration and they don't want to make what is currently illegal immigration legal. They do want some restrictions on abortion. They do like the idea of becoming energy independent because of the more available fuels as a result of fracking. And all of this, yet somehow we elevate a guy like Bernie Sanders to the top ranks of Democratic contenders. Is it possible that it's not half the country, is it? It's a group of primary voters. How do these people who are on the bleeding edge of their political ideology get so much power in that process?
Well, there's a couple things going on there, Scott. The first thing is what you pointed out. Is that the Pauline Kael? Is that the person I'm thinking of?
Who's that?
Wasn't it Pauline Kael, the New York critic who said she couldn't believe Nixon won because nobody she noted voted for him? Wasn't it her? I'm not sure if it was her.
I'm not as
else.
old as you are, Bill. I don't know.
It was late 18th century that this happened. No, but basically this is it. This New York intellectual wakes up the next morning and goes into the office and says, "I'm stunned that Nixon won. I don't know a single person that voted for him." That's really what we're dealing with here. And when you hear progressives say that Americans want unrestricted immigration, let's say, that is an indication that these people are doing what the Bolsheviks did, which is talking amongst themselves and then projecting their beliefs onto the population. And when you run into this kind of thing at its absolute leading edge, you get real disasters. I'll just give you two off the top of my head. The Eisenhower administration was convinced that the Cuban people didn't really back Castro. A number of Cuban exiles had convinced Eisenhower that the Cuban people hated Castro, and all that was needed was an invasion to turn the country back into an anti-communist regime. And so Eisenhower okayed the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy was president for 2 or 3 months when it took place. The entire Bay of Pigs invasion was predicated on the idea that once free Cubans came on shore, the Cuban people would rise up and support it. They did no such thing. They absolutely adored Castro. Same thing with the Tet Offensive in '68. The communists had this overwhelming offensive in the South, utterly convinced that the South Vietnamese were going to rise up and become the communists that they always knew they were, and it just didn't happen. It was a catastrophe for them militarily. So this is why this kind of politics is so dangerous, and it's also why you see the kind of social, I hate to call it social disobedience because I think that term is too respectful. But this is why you see people smashing windows, and why you see the Speaker of the House tearing up the President's State of the Union address. It is a temper tantrum against the fact that reality is calling their bluff, and they can't handle this. And I have maintained now for a while, really at least for the last 5-6 months, that the culture war, America's longest war, is not over, but it's won. And if you look at the history of war, and this is really, I think, the issue here, Scotty, if you look at it, the Japanese had no chance whatsoever to win the Pacific War once their 6-carrier strike force, Kido Butai, was destroyed. 4 of those decks were destroyed at Midway. That was their last chance to win. And it took another 2.5 years of a lot of bleeding and a lot of death. Same for the Germans at Stalingrad, same for the Confederates at Gettysburg. But the point I'm making is this. Once that war is not winnable, there's a period of about a year when denial sets in. The people say, no, well, we can still turn it around. We can still win it. But after that happens, and this is where I think we are now politically, after that happens, the defeated party that has fought and bled and put so much of everything into this idea that has lost then develops a mentality of, well, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down pure. We're going to go down, the Confederacy is going to be the lost cause, and it's going to be the blemishless republic, and the Nazis are going to destroy the tunnels where their people are hiding, because if if the Germans are not destined to win, then no German should be left alive. And the Japanese especially were prepared to deal with an American invasion with 7 million people armed with bamboo spears. You would have to shatter the jewel of Japanese honor, and we will destroy Japan before we'll let it be occupied by the Americans, who they knew were going to win the war for 2 years at that point.
Despite the fact that progressives have had such a hard time winning, or maybe are just culturally opposed to the concept, as this column indicates, you might think that if you're on the left, that they've served a certain role, because certainly the Democratic Party has shifted further to the left incrementally with each election season as the increasingly so-called progressive candidates stand up and talk about climate change, or talk about abortion, or talk about gay rights, or talk,
free health care for illegal immigrants.
What Glenn Beck often refers to as that Overton window, that they've basically shifted the discussion in ways that benefit the progressive movement. One wonders whether the progressives are just a lot more patient than conservatives, for example, and realize that this is a multi-generational struggle.
Oh, I think you've got that exactly backwards, if you'll pardon me for saying so. The progressive, the assault on mainstream American culture as it existed began in the late 50s and early 60s with Saul Alinsky and the Frankfurt School realization that if you're going to turn America into a socialist country, it will not accomplish it by making it about the economy and the workers, the proletariat. You had to make it about the culture and the dispossessed. But all of the weapons that the left started with, basically the occupation of the news media, college campuses, the entertainment business, and then having somewhat reasonable political ideas. All of those over the last 60 years have eroded to virtual dust. These weapons have rusted in their hands. No one trusts the news media to tell us what to think anymore. No one cares what Hollywood celebrities say anymore, for no other reason than people aren't watching movies anymore. They're playing video games and they're watching YouTube. The college system, the educational system in the country used to mean you got an education. Now it just means you got a safe space and some crayons. And their policies have become simply absurd. And so all of the weapons that the left has used over the course of the last 60 years to try and turn America into the America they want it to be have dissolved in their hands. They've failed. And it's the conservatives that have taken the long view. It was the conservatives that have held on to this belief in America. And when I mention those countries, those three cases, the Confederacy, the Nazis, and the Japanese, what I mention this for is because this is very, very important. There is going to be a rapidly increasing, especially after the 2020 election. You're going to see a rapid increase in the kinds of behavior exemplified by Pelosi tearing up the president's speech. Because if you are a true believer and you realize that you've lost, you will be determined to take this attitude. It's the murder-suicide attitude. It's the attitude of all people filled with pride and arrogance. And that is, if I can't have her, then no one can. And that's what we're going to see. There's no question we're going to see it. We're already seeing it. Antifa is the kind of the leading edge of this wave. But when it dawns on the 20% or so, I bet it's actually less than that. I bet it's probably 10, 15% of the population actively willing to get out of bed for socialism, not just talk about it. The number of people willing to actually risk their lives is infinitely smaller than that. But when it dawns on them in 2020 that people have rejected what they're selling and what they have dedicated their lives to by democratic means, then they're going to start thinking, well, we tried the democratic process and it didn't work, so now we're going to have to try something other than the democratic process. That's how these things work. And there's a great deal of sort of self-destructive, kind of Götterdämmerung, kind of this is the end of the world, the battle of the gods, Ragnarok. All of these mythologies have this sort of Armageddon where the forces of good or whatever cannot prevail, and so everything must come down into the fire. And I really think that's what we're seeing here. And I think what this article is saying is he's right. This is an indication of what's coming. These are people who understand that they're losing, and so as they continue to lose, they won't become less progressive. They'll become more progressive. They'll become more dedicated to the idea that this particular philosophy was too noble for this earth and that it must be brought about even though the people are too stupid to realize it, which is exactly the reaction you mentioned earlier when people looked around and said, why aren't they voting for all this free healthcare and unlimited immigration that we know that they want? It's arrogance is what it is. And they're going to pay the price for it. And I'm sorry to say, I think we will too.
David Leonhardt, to sum up here, and we've got to draw this episode to a close, but he calls for a more flexible, more open-minded, less partisan, and more respectful approach of political candidates, and then kind of speculates on some ways that they could do that. Maybe the new approach should involve economic progressivism and cultural moderation that's more reflective of the American public opinion. Different approach to immigration with a path to citizenship for undocumented, but also slow down future immigration. Maybe announcing that fracking and nuclear energy can actually be a crucial part of fighting climate change. And then the final sentence here, which is a prize, or maybe it involves finding more progressive candidates who hunt or talk about their relationship with Jesus Christ and have some related policy positions. What do you think?
There's a meme out there that I've seen for the last 6-7 months or so. It's attributed to Clint Eastwood. I don't know if he said it, but it's got his picture on it, so it's got a kind of kick to it. And the meme says, if you could reason with Democrats, they wouldn't be Democrats. And we're not really talking about Democrats in that case, because most Democrats are reasonable people. You have to understand just how much of an echo chamber the entire culture lives in. Conservatives, because of their belief system, have to go looking for alternative sources of news, and they have to go and fact check things. And if you're not opposed to the mainstream media's theory, you have no real incentive or even a reason to go looking for what's actually going on. So I'm talking about the vast body of Democrats, many of whom we will see voting for Donald Trump in 2020, or at the very least, not voting for either the pathetic, and I mean this in the genuine sense of the word. I don't mean it in a disdainful way. I mean it in a way that elicits an emotional concern. The increasingly pathetic Joe Biden or the angry, bitter old communist who's never worked and wants to take people's stuff. So yeah, I think what he's saying is exactly right, but it locks out the definition. If you have a progressive candidate that goes hunting, or a progressive candidate that wants to talk about reasonable energy alternatives, then they're not a progressive. That's the whole point of what he's saying, and that's why I think he ends it with such a kind of a hyperbolic sentence. If you consider any of these things, if you give deep thought, for example, just deep thought to forget about I'm pro-abortion, I'm anti-abortion, just give deep thought to at what point does a cluster of cells become a human being? Once you have a conversation like that, they're no longer progressives. Progressivism is an ideal that can brook no compromise. And this is why all conservative messaging has to be shut down. And that's why in the Soviet Union and China and in National Socialist Germany, any dissension had to be immediately squashed, and squashed in such a way as to deter future dissension. Because when your entire theory of life is dependent on theory, reality cannot be allowed to intrude into this equation, which is why those societies are so brutal, which is why their leaders are so fanatical and so dangerous, and which is why in the long term, all of them, including the attempt here in the United States, will fail.
Have you gotten your copy yet of the Patriot Post's Patriots Primer on American Liberty? It is free, and if you go to the link in the description below, it'll take you right to the page where you can sign up for a subscription and get that free document that will help you to better understand the foundations upon which American liberty stands, as well as help you convey that more clearly to other people, including young people. So check out the link in that description below. Patriot Post is among those who have supported this enterprise. At the heart and soul of that is our members at BillWhittle.com. You can join the membership and open up new levels of engagement with things that you can't even see on the website right now until you become a member, including some backstage content that some people say is their favorite programming of the week. Check that out at BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.